it's facing forward, and so here we have eyes. The eyes are connected to the brain by the optic nerves. This tissue right here. The optic nerves, that would be a whole bunch of axons carrying visual information from the retina to the brain. So sensory cells in the retina detect light, and action potentials are generated. They move down the axons into the brain. Looking down, as you'll see two hemispheres. This would be the cerebrum, and the outer surface would be the cerebral cortex. Behind the cerebrum would be the cerebellum, and then the most posterior part down here, this would be the spinal cord. So the spinal cord would be carrying axons carrying sensory information from our senses in our body, for example, and also axons from motor neurons leading out to muscles to move our body. In addition, pain fibers and other kinds of sensory neurons. Okay, so if we take a look back at the cerebrum, we can identify four general lobes of the cerebrum. The most anterior lobe is the frontal lobe. From about this position in the sheep brain forward would be the frontal lobe. In humans, it's much larger relative to the rest of the brain than in the sheep. This region back here, the upper surface of this sheep brain, is the parietal lobe. The very posterior part of the cerebrum would be the occipital lobe, and then on the sides of the cerebrum are the temporal lobes. So these would be underneath our temples. Those are the four lobes. If we just look quickly at the ventral surface of the brain, here again we see the eyes, optic nerves. The optic nerves cross at a structure called the optic chiasm, and then axons in the optic nerve synapse in a region of the brain called the thalamus. Can't see it right now. These things sticking out here, these are the olfactory bulbs, and so the sense of smell is processed by these portions of tissue right here. Right underneath this structure here would be the pituitary gland, and here we see the underside of the brain stem. Spinal cord all the way down here, then a region of the brain stem called the medulla, and then the pons and the midbrain, but we can't see that very well right now. Okay, so if we now think about some of the functions of these of the surface of the brain. Okay, so now let's talk about some of the functions associated with different regions of the brain. The surface of the cerebrum is called the cortex. This is where cell bodies are located. Underneath the cortex, as we'll see when we cut into it, will be what's called white matter. The white matter contains all the axons from nerve cells. The cortex itself would be the gray matter containing the cell bodies. So I'll go around to the different lobes and sort of so what we'll do is we'll just talk about each lobe and the functions that are associated with each lobe. Okay, we're going to start in the back of the brain, the occipital lobe. This tissue contains the sensory cortex for vision. So visual information being carried by optic nerves make a connection in a region called the thalamus, and then thalamic cells send axons back to the back part of the brain here in the occipital lobe, and this is called the primary visual cortex. Surrounding tissue in this area process vision in more complicated ways. So occipital lobe is the region that processes visual information. How do we know that? Well, if you damage this area, if you lesion it, where people have some kind of accident and this tissue is damaged, they report that they cannot see. In addition, if you stimulate cells in the posterior part of the brain, patients report that they see spots of light. And finally, if you just record cell activity here When do the neurons make action potentials? They make action potentials when the person is awake and the eyes are open, when they're seeing things. That's the occipital lobe. Now, if we move up, well, actually, let's move down from the occipital lobe down to the temporal lobes. We said occipital lobe has tissue that processes visual information. Visual processing continues down into the temporal lobe. In fact, cells in the visual cortex do send axons to cells on their way down this visual pathway. What seems to be happening in this temporal lobe pathway is that more complex visual features of objects are being processed. So, for example, there are areas of the brain, human brains, and presumably also sheep, that process faces, so we can recognize faces. Other areas of the temporal lobe are involved in object recognition, just any other kind of object. And again, lesions to areas in the temporal lobe can interfere with object recognition and the recognition of faces. The temporal lobe is also the site where it contains the sensory cortex for hearing. How do we know that? Well, again, lesions can produce deafness. If you stimulate the area, people report hearing sounds, tones, and if you record from cells in this area, they become active when the person is exposed to sounds. The temporal lobe is also heavily associated with the memory system. And we'll say more about that as we look at other structures. Underneath the temporal lobe is a structure called the hippocampus, which is involved in memory function. Okay. In humans, not in sheeps, the temporal lobe also contains an area that is associated with language comprehension. It's called Wernicke's area. People who suffer from epilepsy often have damaged tissue in the temporal lobes, and so neurosurgeons will try to cut out that damaged tissue as treatment for epilepsy. All right, let's take a look at the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe back here, also situated right next to the occipital lobe, and again, neurons in the occipital lobe send axons up this pathway towards the parietal lobe. So some visual information is being sent down into the temporal lobe for object recognition. Some visual information is being sent up to the parietal lobe. Now this pathway, some researchers call it the vision for action pathway. Visual information in this pathway seems to be used so as to guide behavior towards objects in the environment. The parietal lobes also contain the sensory cortex for touch. So things that we touch, the axons from sensory cells in our hands and fingers and so on all over our body, that touch information ultimately gets registered by cortical tissue in the parietal lobe. And then in addition, this parietal lobe seems to be involved in representing the self located in space. And that fits with the idea that visual information is being sent along this pathway up into the parietal lobe, because in order to interact with the world visually and bodily, we need to understand where objects are in relation to the self. So a representation of the self seems to be part of the function of the parietal lobe. People with lesions to the parietal lobe, say from stroke, they often have a syndrome called neglect, where they do not, in a sense, pay attention. They neglect stimuli on the opposite side of the body or in visual space. We'll say more about that later. Notice the parietal lobe and temporal lobe, there are regions both associated with language function in humans. Okay. Let's see, what else?